The Old Ways and the New by Son of Balder. I think, Eliza began, that you're placing far too much faith in your thesis. She raised the finely artificed pistol she held in her right hand, firing a brief volley of glowing pink bolts of light at some deformed shape that had been once canid, but now resembled some sort of deformed hedgehog covered in roots and pink crystals. Her shots burned into its flank, and it let out a pained cry before twisting and rushing towards her. There was an angry light in its green eyes. But before she could recharge her pistol and open fire again, Etienne punched forward with his gauntlet. The creature's front was shredded by cogs and gears of golden light, projected in array by Etienne's splayed fingers. It burned away like morning dew in the blazing midday sun, left a broken mess of oozing blood, broken pink crystals, and scraps of green fur. The cogs on Etienne's gauntlet whirled faster for a moment before returning to their steady clicking and clacking. Perhaps, he debated her, as he clenched his fist and summoned his powers again, scanning the battlefield with a roving hazel eye. You are the one looking too deeply into matters. You are a student of starlight and astromantic patterns. I am a student of the clockwork that guides all existence. You study the hands, but I know of the mechanisms beneath the face. And you believe these creatures are incorrect? She asked, though she rolled her eyes again as she did so. Etienne was a good ally and a great thinker in his own abstract way, but he was often so lost in his own mind that he forgot she was not one of his rivals from the Nakani circles. He ignored her and instead pointed to a hill across the battlefield. There, the Karoth with the staff, he said, atop the hill. Eliza followed his pointing finger, observing through the haze of a smoking, blood-soaked battlefield. She saw what he pointed at, and then reached up to fiddle with the set of lenses dangling over her left eye. She slid two into place, each consecutive circle of glass providing her with a closer look at the lanky form of the Karoth mage. With the beehive about his waist, she asked, dangling rather near to his pelvis. Yes, Etienne clutched his scythe in both hands and glanced back at her, and for the record, they are painfully incorrect. This beast proves that. The pair set off down the hill, Astromancer and Nakani priest. To the uninitiated, it was an unlikely pair. But when Etienne saw the wreckage of another shardbot half buried in the mud, the pair halted for a moment. Eliza breathed deep, looking to the sky and drawing strength from the motion of the heavenly bodies. Beneath her, the world turned, and above her, she could sense the sigils of the stars. She touched a finger to the copper plate hanging from her waist, into which she'd engraved the signs of the stars and poured astromantic power into Etienne's outstretched hand. Nakani mechanisms glowed with lilac light, and as the gears spun faster and faster, the priest gestured with his scythe, bidding the construct rise again. Vivid yellow and purple cast strange shadows in the smoke as the little bot slowly reassembled in the air, as its various parts spinning, metal plates binding back together as if riveted into place. Once fully bound, it dropped onto the ground, floating a few inches above the mud. Eliza heard Etienne murmur something under his breath before gesturing grandly. The construct floated away, no doubt looking for more Karoth to kill. You put too much of the mantled hunter in it, complained Etienne quietly, as the pair began their march again. One of these days, you're going to overload the mechanisms, and I'll have lost yet another appendage to your indulgences. Oh, hush, she retorted. The world is still turning, and your little machines are still ticking and talking. You've got nothing to complain about. He had no rebuttal for that, thankfully, and so onward they went into the carnage of the battle. More beasts came, and with the aid of Etienne's now dwindling entourage of shardbots and their own weapons, they made short work of the various crystal-beckoned animals and the bellowing Karoth warriors. In aid to their cause, numerous Federation soldiers were bolstered by the sight of two mages falling in with them. Eliza didn't suppose they'd intended to rally the host, it had simply happened. "For Ashdon!" cried some men, while others roared their own houses. "Garrow! Ackworth!" Some even cried for Ronan, laid waste so recently. And that was half the reason they were here. Some hearts cried for vengeance. Leveler heads simply sought to take back what had been stolen. As Eliza raised her pistol and placed a neat trio of shots into a charging Karoth warrior's chest, she considered the truth of the matter. What could High Lord Jaquise have uncovered within his notes for all this bloodshed to be worth it? Something irreplaceable, clearly. The results of an experiment he could not repeat? Some observation born of deep meditation that could never be seen again? Whatever it was plainly of great import. to House Ashton. And so Eliza come with the host, marching alongside soldiers of half a dozen Federation houses. Etienne had followed, having come at the behest of his clockwork cult to observe the devastation and test the functions of their recently developed constructs in an active battlefield. The older man was the nearest thing she had to a friend, and it paid to have 4 shardbots watching her back. She would beat the rest to those records and uncover just what it was that Jaquise desired so much to recover from the Tellus. Armed with that knowledge, well, knowledge is power, and any astromancer worth their instruments knew power was the key to everything. Etienne did not care for power, he only wanted to prove his grand philosophy superior to the Tellus' religion. Eliza didn't wholly understand it, nor did she care. Their small host ventured across the grim, war-scored ground of the valley, moving closer and closer to their target. Etienne was forced to draw on his own divine powers twice more to shield his machines from enemy weapons. They'd lost several house troops to the axes and teeth of their foes, and yet they came to the base of the rise atop which the Karoth stood with his staff. Eliza raised her pistol, but Etienne laid a hand on her arm. "Steady," he warned her. "The beast will have protections and wards. Let the soldiery take the first shots." It was perhaps a callous thing to say, but he was not wrong. So she waited a moment as several house cadets and an officer took aim with their weapons. Steam gatlings and steam rifles clicked as bolts slid home from their barrels and began to whir. Then, with a shouted order, they opened fire. A stream of bullets fell upon the Karoth mage, who did not move. His mouth opened and a thick wall of vegetation surged from the ground before him, dense roots and bark absorbing much of the incoming fire. The creature crested its makeshift cover, then pointing down upon the soldiers that had dared attack it. Its eyes were covered over by a band of hide, its horns were twisting its head with a dozen ivory tins, from which dangled bands and leather endings in rings of bone and carved flint. It looked old, with gray hairs, long, twisted fingers. Then it beckoned with its gnarled staff, topped with 3 claw branches clinging tight to some black rock bedecked with glowing pink gemstones. A pink light washed over a pair of soldiers as a vortex of smoke and pink lightning swirled into being between them. Both were dragged closer to the strange whirlwind of arcane power, before the creature let out a lowering cry and the pair cried out. One of them began scratching furiously at the skin on his face, screaming about worms beneath. The other lashed out with his knife, nearly striking his own officer across the face as he wailed in terror of some unseen foe. The other soldiers stepped back, horrified by the madness overcoming their fellows. Then Etienne pointed his open hand at the Karoth and summoned forth his blessed cogs again. The ray of light and metal blasted their foe. But whatever arcana this creature had used to bid that terrible vortex into being was clearly interfering with even the priest's machine-like mind. His attack went wide, and so it was left to Eliza to attack instead. She flicked down the largest of her lenses, affording herself a slightly better view of her target, then aligned her pistol and pulled the trigger. The creature didn't even try to dodge. It simply took the shot and slowly turned its eyeless attention to her, staring down with a parted jaw. A smoking crater the size of her palm had been burned into its chest, and it simply glared at her like some beast of burden. Then it raised its staff again as Eliza leveled her pistol for a second shot. She fired at the same time she felt a rush of etheric energy about her, and within an instant fury built in her gorge and she snarled. The beast had thrown her through the ether. Dismissed her like an errant child, Eliza drew herself up to her feet and took off at a steady run. She'd seen the book dangling from the creature's belt, bound in red with a golden sigil marking its cover. If it was not the tome she'd come for, then she'd truly gone mad. Ahead, Etienne was brawling with the creature, or rather, he was dodging bolts of sickly pink lightning while flinging rays of gold back when he had the chance. Slowly he climbed the hill, closing the distance between himself and the Karoth mage. The other soldiers were in full retreat in spite of their officers commanding them to rally. The man's great brown mustache quivered with anger as he turned and charged the creature, hefting his saber. The Karoth didn't so much as turn his way. It simply waved a hand almost dismissively, and the man staggered backwards as if sternly stricken with a great fatigue. Somewhere behind her men, shouting arose. Reinforcements? She hoped not. The prize was hers and hers alone. She charged across the open ground, raising her pistol, a fury igniting her astromantic power. The ether was stronger and stronger here, the amount of magic being thrown about, putting a steadiness in her arm that had not been there before. She fired once, twice, a third time, each bolt missing, and when she cried out in frustration to look at her, that was a mistake. The Karath drove the end of its staff into his breast, throwing him back across the hilltop and into the hard and packed earth. He shifted once and then lay still, scythe limping in at an outstretched hand. Eliza climbed the hill. Her breathing was ragged, and each breath like a knife in her side. She was sore and utterly without recourse. It had to be finished. And it had to finish now, or she'd never claim the tome. Etienne was stirring, but the Karath's blind gaze was for her and her alone. She drew herself into her full height and reached the hill's summit, staring across the blind beast. It looked upon her like some sort of cow, hefting its staff in both hands. She raised her pistol. She could not see the stars above, but she could feel them, turning and moving through the sky in their glacial way. She let that knowledge fuel her, the boundless light and heat of the great flames of the heavens, and when she breathed in, she could taste the magic in the air. The Karath bellowed and charged her, ready to club her to death like the savage Etienne purported it to be. Eliza pushed all that fire and heat and light into her pistol, setting the crystals built into its steel frame alight with fire. The barrel began to glow about the end, but she did not fire. She waited, letting the creature come nearer and nearer. Only once it was all but on her, its animal stink polluting the air as she breathed. That's when she pulled the trigger. The resultant blast of astromantic energy was like a cannon shot from a city wall. The impact blasted through the creature's bare torso, burning through flesh and bone alike, blowing chunks of scorched meat out through the gaping hole in its back. For a moment, Eliza could see behind the monster, across the hilltop and the fields beyond. Then it fell upon her, its great corpse propelled by its former momentum, and threw her to the ground. It was dead, that much was plain. It was also heavy, and it stank of burnt meat and hair. She strained, shoving the corpse off her body, a death rattle grasp escaping its lips, and in it she heard terrible words that made sense only to the tiny animal part of her mind that quailed in fear when the sun goes down. Then she rolled and rose to her feet. Etienne was on one knee, hand pressed against the dent in his bronze breastplate. She paid him no mind, not in those moments of victory. Instead, she searched for her prize, and on the monster's belt she found it. She tore it free, snapping the length of catgut the creature had fastened it to its belt with. She pulled it open, and with wide eyes she looked inside. Charts and graphs and a page after page of equation greeted her eyes. It would take a year or more to study it all, so she secreted it away in her bag before finally going to Etienne's side. His breath was hard and ragged and wet under his metal mask. "Is it what you'd hoped for?" he asked her. "More," she replied. "It's hope for all of us." "Good," the priest nearly choked on the word. "I think I should like to rest now." He fell on his side with a heavy thud and spoke no more. Eliza let him fall. He might die. If he did, he would die happy. He'd proven that his Mechanica were superior to the Karath's so-called elder ways. If he lived, Eliza had no further need of him. She clutched her bag tighter to her side and smiled beneath her metal mask. She had no further need for anyone. Wow, everybody, that was a absolutely terrific story. This is a great example of when you look at any type of game that exists where they have, lore for individual units, like really taking those little bits of lore bites that each unit brings to the table and putting it into a story format. We see here a bunch of stuff that we know about the various sub-factions and stuff like that within the Atmos Federation. For example, the way the Nikanai priesthood is totally separate and distinct from anything that has to do with the government, who also has a part in controlling the Astromantic Order. It also highlights the internal competition within the faction, that essentially the way that the Astromantic Order functions is essentially like individual researchers and doing their own projects. And so she was essentially told, okay, there's a journal in here from Jaquise, who is the foremost thinker on all things, astromancy. That's your target. And so, taking personal initiative, grabbing some friends, and building those relationships between different government bodies. There's a huge mix of different households represented. She strikes out, gets the tome, and now that she has the prize, doesn't tell anyone, because that research is going to be her way to the top. And in this story, we see the coolest things about some of the army building and the internal struggles of each faction, which is just everybody's out for themselves, but in very different ways. Not in a malicious way or anything like that, but this is just, if it is what she says she is, like meaning it's hope for all of us, we can distill this into more weapons and more technology and all these kinds of great, amazing things. Well, that's an ends justify the means thing rather than just being purely malicious. All in all, I thought it was a perfect depiction of an Akane priest and an Astromancer having to work together, go across a battlefield. We got to see some of the Karoth in action, mostly obviously the mage. And if you want to talk about bringing real rules into story and vice versa, the fact that the Astromancer missed most of her shots, I can attest, is absolutely accurate. They're not gun mages, but when they hit, it's nasty. Now, if you're wondering where this story comes from, this is part of the Legacy of Atmos lore contest. We announced our winners over on that Discord. If you want to go check it out and get signed up for the next event, go ahead and do that in the link down below. Again, another big shout out to Son of Balder for this story. Thank you so much, and we'll be following up with the next two. That's second place and third place, because the old ways and the new are, of course, our winner. Very, very soon. So thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in the next Legacy of Atmos lore video. Happy wargaming.